100 wrestling matches, 100 opponents, 100 defeats, none of them hers. Every man who challenged her and lost had to surrender a horse. By the time she was 30, she owned more than 10,000 of them. Her name was Kutulun. She was a princess of the Mongol Empire, the favorite daughter of Kaidu Khan, the ruler who held more territory in Central Asia than any other sovereign of his era. She commanded 40,000 soldiers in the field. She rode beside her father in every major campaign for 2 decades, and when Kaidu Khan was dying, he declared in front of his generals that she, not any of his 14 sons, should inherit his throne. You have never been taught this name. If you encountered her at all, it was probably through a distorted Italian account that transformed a military commander into a romantic spectacle. If you encountered her at all, how does a woman who commanded the largest cavalry force in 13th century Central Asia disappear from the history books entirely? That is exactly what this video is about. The erasure of Kutulun did not happen by accident, and it did not happen gradually. It happened in stages, through specific decisions made by specific writers in specific centuries. And understanding those decisions is the only way to understand how comprehensively her story was buried. The first stage began with Marco Polo. Polo traveled through Central Asia between 1271 and 1295. He encountered accounts of Kutulun, her wrestling victories, her military record, her political prominence, and he wrote about her. But Polo was a Venetian merchant writing for a European audience that had a fixed idea of what Asian women were. His account emphasized the wrestling as romantic theater. A princess who would only marry a man who could defeat her. The military command, the battlefield record, the political succession. These received a fraction of the attention. The story that reached Europe was a curiosity, a spectacle, not a commander. The second stage was more systematic. After the collapse of the Chagatai Khanate in the late 14th century, the primary historical records of Kaidu Khan's court were written or rewritten by Persian and Chinese chroniclers working within institutional frameworks that had little interest in documenting the political authority of Mongol women. The historian Thomas Olson, writing in 2001, documented how these secondary chronicles progressively reduced Kutulun's role, first from military commander to political advisor, then from political advisor to colorful anecdote. Each generation of rewriting removed one layer of her actual record. The third stage was Western academia. When 19th century European historians began systematically cataloging the Mongol Empire, they worked primarily from Persian and Chinese sources, the same sources that had already stripped Kutulun's military authority from the record. The result was a historiographic circularity. Western scholars cited Asian sources that had already erased her, and cited the absence of more detailed Western sources as evidence that there was nothing more to find. She was not lost, she was filed away. So let's correct the record. To understand who Kutulun was, you need to understand the world she was born into. And that world was not what most people imagine when they think about the Mongol Empire. Picture the steppe in 1260. The Mongol Empire is the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Poland. It is administered through a system of khanates, each a sovereign territory controlled by a branch of Genghis Khan's descendants. The one that concerns us is in the heart of Central Asia, the domain of Kaidu Khan, grandson of Ogedei Khan, who himself was the son of Genghis. Kaidu's territory, the western portion of what would become the Chagatai Khanate, covers roughly 4 million square kilometers. He has refused to acknowledge the authority of Kublai Khan, his cousin and nominal overlord, and has maintained his independence through nearly 4 decades of military resistance. He is, by every measure, one of the most powerful rulers on earth. And among all his children, 14 sons and 1 daughter, the one he trusts most in the field is Kutulun. The scholar Timothy May, writing in his 2012 study of Mongol military organization, documented that Kutulun's military role was not ceremonial. She commanded an independent force of approximately 40,000 cavalry, a number that, in the context of 13th century Central Asia, represents a standing army larger than anything most European kingdoms could field. She did not advise. She commanded. She deployed. She fought. This needs to be clear, because the temptation inherited from Marco Polo and repeated in most of the popular accounts that exist today is to treat her military record as secondary to the wrestling. It is not. The wrestling was a custom, and it was documented. But it was a single dimension of a woman whose primary identity was that of a military commander and a political heir. What the historian Maurice Rosebi, writing in 1979, documented about Mongol women's status gives important context. Among the nomadic peoples of the steppe, women held a category of political and martial authority that had no equivalent in sedentary civilizations of the same era. They managed households that functioned as mobile administrative units. They commanded troops in the absence of husbands or fathers. They negotiated treaties. In the specific subculture of the ruling Borjigin clan, the family of Genghis Khan, women of exceptional ability were not just tolerated in positions of power, they were cultivated for it. Kutulun's military authority was not an exception to the rule. It was the rule applied to its most capable practitioner. If this is already changing something you thought you knew about the Mongol world, leave a comment. I want to know what shifted first. The wrestling record is where we can be most precise, because it is the most documented dimension of Kutulun's life. And even here, the documentation is more serious than it first appears. The custom Kutulun maintained was this: she would not accept a husband she had not defeated in wrestling. Any man who wished to marry her had to wager horses. If he won, she would accept the match. If she won, she kept the horses. According to the account preserved in the Persian chronicle Tariq-i-Rashidi, compiled by Mirza Muhammad Haidar Duglat in the 1540s from earlier sources, the men who challenged her, and there were many, left the field defeated, 100 of them. The 10,000 horses represent the aggregate of those losses. Consider what this actually means, separated from the romantic framing that Marco Polo attached to it. This was not primarily a matrimonial ritual. This was a public demonstration, repeated over many years, that the woman who commanded 40,000 soldiers was also the most physically capable fighter in her father's court. The two facts reinforce each other. The wrestling was a declaration of standing, not a search for a husband. The historian Judith Jesch, in writing on warrior women in medieval literature and record in 1991, drew a distinction that matters here: the difference between documented physical combat records and literary embellishment of female warriors. Kutulun falls firmly in the documented category. The wrestling matches are attested in multiple independent sources: Polo's account, the Tariq-i-Rashidi, and references in the Jami al-Tawarikh, the universal history compiled by Rashid al-Din Hamadani in 1307. These are not a single chain of hearsay. They are independent attestations of the same record. 100 matches, 0 defeats. That is not legend. That is a documented athletic and military reputation spanning decades. But the wrestling, as remarkable as it is, was only part of the story. What happened between Cthulhu and the question of succession would prove far more significant and far more dangerous to the people who needed her story erased. Kaidu Khan died in 1301 or 1303. The sources disagree on the exact year, which itself is a symptom of how disorganized the historical record of his court became in the aftermath of what followed. Before his death, he made his political preference explicit. According to accounts preserved in both Persian and Chinese chronicles, he expressed his wish that Cthulhu succeed him, not as a regent, as ruler. His 14 sons disagreed. What followed was a succession crisis that lasted years, involved shifting alliances, military confrontations between factions, and the eventual fragmentation of Kaidu's unified territory. Cthulhu was at the center of it. She held military forces and political support sufficient to make any resolution without her cooperation impossible. The Persian historian Wasaf, writing in the early 14th century, close enough to the events to draw on direct sources, documented her continued military activity in this period, commanding forces loyal to her father's memory against the faction that eventually consolidated power. She did not win the succession, but she forced a years-long standoff against 14 opponents, some of whom commanded the armies of one of the most formidable military traditions in human history. I want to be precise about what this means. This is not a story about a woman who was remarkable by the standards of her time and place. That framing is already a diminishment. This is a story about a woman who was remarkable by the standards of any time and any place, who commanded a force that no European king of the same era could match, who maintained an undefeated martial record against all challengers, and who nearly inherited sovereign authority over 4 million square kilometers of territory. The standards of her time and place are not the ceiling of what this means. They are the floor. If you want more history that rewrites what you thought you knew, subscribe. This is what this channel does, every single video. The succession crisis resolved, eventually, against her. The exact circumstances of her death are not recorded with precision, another symptom of the erasure that followed. What the record does show is that after her death, the process of rewriting her role accelerated. The political factions that had opposed her had every reason to minimize her military authority and her claim to succession. The chronicles they influenced did exactly that. And then Marco Polo's account reached Europe, and the woman who had commanded 40,000 soldiers became, in the Western imagination, a princess who liked to wrestle suitors. The legacy of Cthulhu is not preserved in Western history books, but it is preserved in other ways, and those ways matter. The first is the military record itself. The 13th century step system of command that produced Cthulhu was not anomalous, it was structural. Timothy May's 2012 analysis documented multiple instances of Mongol women holding independent military commands across the same period. Not in support roles, not as substitutes for unavailable men, but as designated commanders with loyal forces. The system that created Cthulhu created others. Most of those names were erased by the same mechanisms. What survives of their record is fragmentary, precisely because the subsequent historiographic tradition found no use for it. The second legacy is geographic. The territory that Kaidu Khan controlled and that Kutulun helped defend through 2 decades of military campaigns corresponds today to portions of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Western China. The political and ethnic contours of that region were shaped in part by the military outcomes of conflicts in which she was an active participant. The borders that exist today in Central Asia are not arbitrary. They are the residue of decisions made by armies. Some of those armies were hers. In the third legacy is historiographic, and it is the most direct. The specific mechanism by which Kutulun's story was reduced from military commander to wrestling anecdote is a case study in how gender bias operates inside historical record-keeping, not through active malice in every instance, but through a consistent pattern of selective attention. What gets recorded, what gets repeated, what gets cited, and what gets filed away as peripheral color. The wrestling made it into the Western record because it fit a narrative Western audiences already had. The command authority was omitted because it didn't. Picture this. It is 1307 in Tabriz. Rashid al-Din Hamadani is compiling the Jami al-Tawarikh, the most comprehensive history of the Mongol Empire that will ever be written. He has access to sources that no longer exist, oral traditions from within the Borjigin clan, administrative records from Kaidu's court. He writes about Kutulun. The passage is brief, but it is there. It acknowledges her military role. It acknowledges her wrestling record. It acknowledges her father's preference for her succession. That document exists. That passage survived, and it spent 6 centuries cited by almost no one writing in a Western language. The document was always there. The decision was to leave it out. There is a pattern in the buried empire's archive, and Kutulun is one of its sharpest illustrations. The women who get erased are not the women who were quiet or peripheral. They are the women who were so central, so capable, so evidently powerful, that the narrative framework of the civilizations that followed could not accommodate them. They had to be reduced because their original scale was incompatible with what came after. Kutulun commanded 40,000 soldiers. She was undefeated in 100 public combat matches. Her father, who had successfully defended his territory against the largest empire in the world for 40 years, chose her above all his sons to inherit what he had built. You were never taught this name. That is not an accident. It is a choice that was made in specific texts by specific writers across specific centuries, and the choice tells you something, not just about Kutulun, but about whose power history has always found easiest to erase. History does not forget the powerful. It edits them. Which story do you think history has buried the deepest? Tell me in the comments, because the next video I make might be the one you name. The next episode is about a woman who did something no military commander in her region had managed for 2 centuries. She looked at the most powerful empire on her continent, and she didn't retreat. She negotiated. Her name is Queen Nzinga, and the story of what she actually agreed to and what she refused is nothing like what the Portuguese wrote about it.